Kakadosh Boker Tov. We're just continuing with halachot of achana, preparing from Shabbat to the weekday or other halachot pertaining this. Today we're going to speak about a very important halacha which has to do with folding a talit from one Shabbat to another Shabbat, which means if you have a Shabbat talit, are you allowed to come and to fold it on Shabbat, or is that considered that you are preparing from one Shabbat to another Shabbat? So the basis of this is that Rabbeinu Chananel on the Gemara in Shabbat, Tafkuf Yud Gimel, where it says, Adam echad mekapel kelim milele Shabbat le-Shabbat. A person can fold utensils from the night of Shabbat to Shabbat, uv Shabbat mitzafra lepanya, or in the Shabbat in the morning to the afternoon, ul Shabbat acheret, and to another Shabbat. So therefore, and then he says, V'chi amrinan שמקפל אדם מתחילת השבת לסופו בשאין לו בגדים אחרים להחליף, אבל יש לו להחליף אינו מקפל. But says Rabbeinu Chananel that if right now, when do we say you're allowed to fold clothing? Only if you don't have other clothing. But if you do have other clothing, then you're not supposed to fold the clothing. Now they come and they argue on Rabbeinu Chananel because they bring a Tosefta. The Tosefta says, מדכין כלים משבת לאותה שבת, אבל לא משבת זו לשבת אחרת. Which means the Tosefta is like a Braita, is another external part of the Gemara, which obviously has a very, very high. That means even though Rabbeinu Chananel was one of the Geonim, but he can't come and start arguing on a Tosefta. Tosefta is like a Braita, but it's a little bit external. That's why it was called the Tosefta. And what happens is that right now, if the Tosefta says Mefurash, you're allowed to wash the different utensils, but you're allowed to wash them, but not from one Shabbat to another Shabbat. So what is Rabbeinu Chananel then talking about? And furthermore, he says at the end, he says that if you have other clothing, you're allowed to do it. If you don't have other clothing, you're not allowed to do it. So he comes and he says over here, the Maaseh Shabbat, he brings down, and he says as follows. He says, really, Be'emet, there's not a stira from the Rabbeinu Chananel to the Tosefta. Why? He comes and he says like this. He says, first of all, to do with the Yisur of Achana, there's no Yisur of Achana if it's going to be for the next Shabbat. However, though, to do with Kipul Begadim, there is going to be, which means if you're going to come and start folding clothing is worse than just Stam coming and preparing from one Shabbat to another Shabbat. And therefore he comes and he says, however, though, if it has nothing to do with one another, so for example, we're talking about the Talit of Shabbat. So the Rav Yitzchak Falaji, he comes and he says in Sefer Yafel Alev, Mutar lekapel talit miyuchedet leShabbat mishabbat leShabbat. You're allowed to come and to fold your talit, which is especially designed just for Shabbat, from one Shabbat to another Shabbat. But even according to the Tosefta in Shabbat, that says that it's going to be asur, here you could be matir. Why? Because the entire Yisur was only if letzorech machar, if it's going to be for the necessity of tomorrow. However, he comes, why? But then it looks like you're preparing from Shabbat to Chol. However, though l'Shabbat acheret, it should be mutar, because it's considered kemekapel mishachrit lemincha, shemutar lechol hadeot, that it's considered ki'ilu that you're coming and you're folding a clothing for shachrit to mincha, meaning in the morning you're allowed to come, and that's going to be the next halakha to do with washing dishes. You're allowed to come and do something from the morning to the afternoon. There's no problem of achana, of preparing, but it's within the same Shabbat. So he wants to say it's the same halakha when you're folding a talit, not clothing, but when you're folding a talit from one Shabbat to another Shabbat, you're allowed to come and you're allowed to fold it on Shabbat. However, if it's going to be stam clothing, you cannot fold it for another Shabbat. You could only fold it if you don't have any other clothing, then you're allowed to come and you're allowed to fold the clothing on Shabbat. So just to finish off, remember that to do with folding the talit on Shabbat, mitzad hachana, there will not be an isur. I will finish by saying that there was a very interesting halakha that we brought down, is that why isn't it considered hachana also? There's another reason. Right? The Falk, alav shalom, when we went to him, Zatzal, when he went to him, he went and he said that really be'emet, if you're folding it in order that it doesn't get creased, it doesn't get ruined, so therefore there's also not a problem of achana. He says, why? Then where's the proof? The proof is that you're allowed to be metaltel muktzeh, right? Akli shemelachto le'eter me'achana letzel. What is achana, right, from chama letzel, which means if it's from the sun, and the sun's rays is coming down on it and it's going to destroy it, you're allowed to bring it into the house, you're allowed to put it in the shade so it doesn't get ruined. The question is, why isn't that considered achana? I'm preparing it. Right now, I have no purpose or no usage for this kli shemelachto le'eter, for this utensil, which is of permissible use, which means I'm allowed to use it on Shabbat. So why am I allowed to come and I'm allowed to move it from one place to another? So he said, from here we learn a yesod, that if you're going to come and you're going to do something on Shabbat, in order to preserve an item, meaning that you don't want it to get ruined. So for example, I just finished my meal on Friday night. why are you allowed to put the food back in the fridge? Now we're not talking about, or in the freezer, now we're not talking about food that I'm going to use the next day, because that for sure I'm allowed to do. Even if I'm going to put it in the freezer, which means that I'm not going to use it until next Shabbat, or whenever it is during the weekday that I'm going to take it out, as long as I'm doing it because I want to preserve it, that it shouldn't get ruined, there is no isur of achana mi Shabbat lechol. So that's a very important yisod that I think we have to remember to do with achana, that if you're doing it to preserve, there's not going to be any problem whatsoever of achana.